Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. This is Washington Policy Center's virtual event held every other week. It's a noontime event, it's free, and we use this as an opportunity to highlight some of our center directors' work and give you a chance to ask questions based on that. Now, usually we have a number of center directors on the show, and we update you on a wide variety of items. This time, we're going to do it a little bit differently. Today, we're going to focus on a single study, a single release, and that is a new study regarding learning loss from Liv Finne, who is obviously with us now. But what we'll do first is I just want to review, giving people a chance to log on. We're a little late today because of some technical difficulties we were having. I wanted to give you a chance to remember, this is your opportunity to ask Liv questions. In your invitation today, we sent out a number of key takeaways that we'll be discussing today. If you've got questions based on those, you can ask them at any time. There's a Q&A function right there at the bottom of your Zoom bar. For some people, it might be on the side. Try to ask your questions in the Q&A section, not the chat section, because for me as moderator, it's easier for me to see your questions if you have them in the Q&A box. And so today we released Liv's study, and by release, I mean we published it to the WPC webpage. We've sent copies out to all of the regional media outlets, as well as a couple of national outlets. We've sent some actualities out to radio stations, and those are actualities, it's a fancy way of saying sound bites, to radio stations detailing some of what Liv concluded from this study. So that's what a release means, and we've sent it to you, and it's available to you right there at washingtonpolicy.org. You can download the whole study, you can take pieces of it, and we'd encourage you to do this. Take the piece that, that means the most to you and share that with friends and family and others. And as you're reading through it, just set pieces to the side. It's harder to share the whole thing because people generally don't consume an entire body of work, especially a 16-page paper in one sitting. So it's easier if you just grab sections or, a paragraph or a sentence, a finding that that particularly bothers or intrigues you, and you share that individual piece, and then you share that multiple times over a period of days. That's the way we'd like to see it done, if possible, from you, for those of you who have been reading this study. And now I'd like to bring Liv on to talk about it. Liv, this has been long in the works. I know you put a lot of effort into this particular study regarding learning loss and school closures. Why don't we first just set the stage with the policy itself? What did Governor Inslee do in response to the COVID pandemic? What did he do with the schools? And what did the Superintendent of Public Instruction do with the schools? How long did it last? Let's just start with that and then move on to what it ended up doing.
Well, the first part of the study provides the dates of the emergency proclamations by the governor starting in March 2020 when he closed the schools due to the COVID health crisis. And that's the first part of the study. It goes through the period of time that encompasses all the emergency orders regarding to the schools. So from March of 2020, the summer of 2020, the fall of 2020, then in the winter of 2020, there were emergency proclamations. And then you'll recall that in February of 2021, the national CDC declared that it was safe to go back to school, and the teachers union intervened, the AFT teachers union intervened with the Biden administration to change that recommendation, which slowed down the return to school in the spring of 2021. And then I have the emergency proclamations that happened after that when the governor reopened the schools in a limited fashion in the spring of 2021. And then you'll all recall that the schools then were told to reopen to in-person instruction in the fall of 2021. And yet there were closures that were by district even that fall. So we're saying that the interruption of the children's education, we're trying to take the point of view of the child who had his education interrupted for nearly 2 years and what that impact was of all those orders. And of course, like you said, it's difficult to get your hands around such a big subject. There's 1.1 million school children in Washington state that were affected by this decision to close the schools. But you see, it was not just one decision, it was a decision to keep them closed, because as you look at what happened in other states, that the fall of 2020, many states reopened their schools to in-person instruction. Utah, Montana, Texas, Florida, Pennsylvania, many states reopened that fall of 2020 when Washington's schools were shut tight down. And as that fall progressed, 2020 and the winter, the parents in Washington state started getting more and more agitated and upset, because they knew friends and cousins and family members whose kids were going to school in other states, and yet the schools remain closed here. So that is kind of the big picture story I put in the study with the dates, so everybody could remember what happened. And then in the second part of the study, I collected the research from a variety of research institutions that were quantifying the learning loss, the mental and psychological harm, and the loss to lifetime earnings that this would impose, a permanent setback in the lives of the children affected by these school closures, from which many students will not recover. And in order, of course, to evaluate the wisdom of that policy, we must see its impacts. And what we're concluding is that this was, you can read the study yourself, just read the conclusion. We concluded that this was not necessary to be done, that the fear of adults overrode the needs of the children, and that there were other ways to keep schools open. I mean, private schools here in Washington state opened with safety measures in place the fall of 2020. Many public charter schools did the same. So we're not going to see, of course, I couldn't collect all the evidence. The evidence keeps coming out. There's new evidence every month, and we're going to see more evidence from these research institutions that we're talking about: University of Washington, Harvard University, Yale University, National Bureau of Economic Standards, Amplify, Curriculum Associates. I thought I just looked for every respected and a direct and accurate research showing the damage to children. So that's how I approached it.
Okay, we've covered some additional ground here that beyond the initial scope. But let me go back to one of the things that you pointed out, which was the CDC releases guidance saying, hey, it's safe to open schools. And there was some political pressure from teachers unions that changed that, and it's interesting to note that, because we frequently hear, usually it's an accusation against people who are right of center, that they're ignoring the science, and we've brought this up in the environmental movement a number of times, where you have a policy, it's not efficient, the data shows it's not efficient, it's not actually accomplished anything, and that same thing doesn't happen. But here it is again in the education sphere, where you have guidance that's based on data and the best available medical science, and it's still being, it was still ignored. You brought up a number of different states, but there were also different countries that never closed. And so you were able to see the difference between, these places that had minimal closures or no closures versus places that had serious closures. And if I remember correctly, Liv, some of the data that you cited in your report, they were dealing with the closures that were severely damaging to students in terms of learning loss and psychological and emotional harm and other things, but they were a much shorter duration than Washington's nearly 2-year break. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, so that's what, it's hard to get our hands on the dates. So remember, March 2020 was when the schools were closed across the world, all the states. Everyone was reacting to the COVID crisis in March of 2020. And many states and most states and countries kept their schools closed that spring. But the question was how they changed over that summer, what they did differently. And when I did this research, I was struck by the fact that most European countries reopened their schools 3 or 4 months after they were initially closed. They opened them in September of 2020. And so did many, Australia, many countries in Asia also did that. They figured out ways to socially distance, wear masks, keep the kids safe. And that's because the research was showing, the science was showing that children were not transmitters of this virus, and that you could held the teachers, the adults who are in the school system who are high risk of contracting the virus or high risk of dying from the virus to not teach. You could replace the older teachers with the younger teachers and run a school system successfully if you just respect the science and respected the paramount need to keep students on track with their learning. And that is what was lost track of here in Washington State, because so that September of 2020, Washington State kept its schools closed. The governor decided to keep the schools closed. And that fall, states across the nation started reopening. And that's when the stress became huge on parents here. And I was watching very closely, for example, on Facebook, there was a very active parents group that was screaming and hollering because they saw that other states were opening their schools. And this group was saying, who's in charge here? Who is, and they got assurances from their local superintendent that school would open on such and such a date. And then the date would arrive and the union would refuse to reopen the schools. And that's when sort of the clouds, the misunderstanding about who's in charge of opening the schools was removed from the minds of parents in the Bellevue School District and across Washington State, that it didn't really matter what the governor said, what the state superintendent said, what the local superintendent said. If the union wasn't going to open the schools, they were not going to open the schools. And so that was the struggle that happened over the winter of 2020-21. And then in February of 21, the CDC declared, and that's what you were referring to. The CDC was saying that it was going to be safe to open the schools. And I remember Fauci saying that in early February, late January, early February, said the harm to children outweighs the danger of reopening the schools from, the danger from COVID. And so these national officials were saying, reopen the schools, and the union weighed in at the top levels and rewrote that instruction. So that gave enough justification for the local union here in Washington State to say, no, we don't want to do that. So we were still fighting to get the schools open. February 2021, finally in March 2021, and I think I'm going to take some credit for this because I was screaming. I noticed that we were 47th in the nation. We still were not open. Everyone else was open. I got this on TV, and then 2 weeks later, the governor declared that there was an emergency. My goodness, there was another emergency. The mental and psychological well-being of our students was at risk, and therefore he had to override the union's desire to keep the schools closed for the rest of the year, and then issued this order in March of 2021 saying that in 6 weeks the schools have to open 30% of the time, which was, as far as I was concerned, was nothing. That too little too late at the end of the school year 2021. By that time, all the learning had been lost, and opening the schools for 10 hours a day and 10 hours a week was not going to catch the kids up. So that was also a bad decision. It should have been delayed for 6 weeks. The whole thing was very harmful to children. And so putting together the data, now that's the thing to think about, Dave, is that if you take a child who is in first or second grade, they've got 2 years, the 2 years in their lives when they're 6 and 7 years old to learn how to read well. That time is precious to that child. That time will never come back. And that is the time that was taken away from children at all different levels of education, from kindergarten through 12th grade. And imagine that 11th and 12th graders that needed to get some credits to go to college, they didn't get them. So you have to think about it from that perspective. And that clarifies what the harm was, because as a system, now individual teachers may have tried to evaluate the loss that children had, but as a system, the system just said, okay, move on through to the next grade, whether or not you have the skills you need to succeed. And so
right. And that brings us to a different point, which is, when you're talking, and that's a good way to put it, there's key moments in the lives of children that you don't get back, key learning opportunities that are difficult to make up for if a child, and this is true emotionally, socially, and intellectually, it's difficult to make up for those things if they're missed at a certain point in time. But basically what you're saying is the states basically come along at the end of all of this, with numerous experts showing evidence of harms, emotional, psychological, and intellectual with learning loss, and basically said, all right, let's move forward. So we've got, this promotion in terms of advancing in grade without necessarily the advancing of the skill set there, which can cause, as you've talked about a number of times in the past, Liv, which can cause problems in the follow-up grades because the learning that's taking place there is built on the foundation of what was supposed to take place beforehand. And that's the challenge that we're going to see continue for the next 10 years as kids move their way through the school system and through colleges and so forth.
Exactly. And so I thought of one of the quotes that I got into the paper on the section about how low-income Black and Hispanic students are at risk of not catching up from a February 2022 report from Amplify. It warned about this damage compounding over time, which is your point here. And the quote says, "This is an all hands on deck moment. Aiming for recovery is the wrong goal because pre-pandemic literacy rates were already a problem. Literacy instruction for the K-2 age group has always been critical. Now we're seeing second grade students who have spent their entire school lives in the pandemic losing the most instructional time, the most important moments for learning to read." And then they say, if we don't help them, the struggles will compound. The older these students become, the longer it will take them to catch up. And I mean, so there are other studies from Curriculum Associates of 9 million, a study of 9 million children showing that the percentage of students that are now 2 or more grade levels behind in reading and math has grown from 30 to 40%. Okay, that's a 10% increase in the number of students who are 2 or more years behind. So this is a major problem. And the system just shrugged its shoulders and said, okay, we're going on. You, the second grade student that didn't get the skills you needed to succeed in third grade, you're going to be put in third grade. And good luck to you.
And so I guess one way to look at it too would be it's a 10% increase in the overall number of kids, but it's a 33% increase in the number of kids that aren't reaching that level, when you think about it that way.
Yeah.
That's a huge issue. And there's been a lot of talk from the OSPI about the desire to fix the achievement gap, the learning gap between minority students and white students particularly. And you point out that these learning losses most significantly impacted low-income minority kids and special needs kids. And it did so in a particularly dramatic way, which a lot of research is pointing to a long-term problem that can't go away quickly. And yet we don't hear a lot what do we hear from the state in terms of how they're going to address that or how they're going to try to correct that?
Well, Washington State has $1.5 billion in federal COVID relief funds designated for the schools that has not been spent to date. We've received $2.84 billion over the course of COVID, and the schools have not spent $1.5 billion of that money. And that money could be handed over to parents, and that would give every child in the Washington State $1,400 to hire a tutor so they can get individual assessment at where they are, where the holes are in their learning, and fill in those gaps. That would be what you would do if you were a rational actor here. But this is not happening. I'm hearing lip service paid to learning loss recovery, but I don't see any real from the leaders of our state. I don't see any real urgency. We're just going into another legislative session. We need more money for healthcare counselors in the schools, that kind of thing. This is what I'm hearing. I'm not hearing there's a crisis here. Our children are behind. We need to help them. We're hearing all about teachers not coming back, a shortage of teachers. You can see why teachers are frustrated. they are fake,
It's also strange though that we haven't had a lot of media coverage asking that question about, hey, these achievement gaps are increasing because of COVID, and this previously has been a major concern of education reformers, and supposedly the education establishment. This gap. You have this event that exacerbated that. And then there's no follow-up. There's no, hey, this caused that. So how do we fix it? One, And how do we reassess the policy that caused it to begin with? You know, is it, I mean, obviously in life, there are some things that are not possible. You know, there's accidents and horrible things that happen where you just, there's no way to fix it. But in this case, we have examples of other places that didn't create this larger problem. So you'd think that that would be a high priority discussion to fix it, if only for that, if that were the only thing we were talking about, but that's not what we're seeing.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. We're always hearing about this terrible academic achievement gap between minority children and their peers in the schools. We hear it all the time. And it's particularly bad in Washington State because there's so few alternatives. There's so few options given to parents to take the money that is provided for their student to a high functioning charter school. We only have 18 charter schools in Washington State. You know, the states like, I think it was, Arizona. Arizona has 526 charter schools serving 20% of the student population. So if you are a low income family and you're looking for a better option than your assigned public school, you've got options. You've got options. And that makes a difference in the long run to individual families, giving parents options. By contrast, here in Washington State, we are closing down the options. The charter schools are being starved of funding. They do not get equal funding, and they are now not allowed to expand as a sector. They've been limited. So that is the absolutely wrong approach to things. If you really care, if you really mean what you say about helping low-income minority children catch up in school and have better learning options, you would open more charter schools. You would give them direct aid to go to private school. But you don't see that happening. So I have become a cynic in this matter. I see these children being used in a political ploy for more funding. I'm sorry, that's the way I see it, because that's what the results tell me.
Well, there's a show I quote often on this here and in my broadcasting career. It's Yes Minister / Yes Prime Minister. And there was, you know, when I watched the response of the school closures and the crisis that unfolded, which was, you know, obviously the question was, how do we get kids to learn? They can't go to school, and they weren't set up. There are some online classes that people have practiced it. They've got, you know, they have classes. They have expertise in how to make that effective. And there are some kids that it works well for and some that it doesn't. But this was kind of a blanket. All right, everybody, we're just going to toss you into this online hope, the same place where you're playing your video games. We're hoping that you'll learn something here, maybe, maybe not. And it reminded me, and the big concern was, how are we going to keep these schools funded that are empty? And there was an episode of the TV show where the hospital was empty, and they were all desperate to make sure the hospital didn't lose funding, because even though there was no patients, you know, and it was life imitating art there, which was, you know, kind of sad. But one of the other things, you know, that you pointed out in this was researchers from McKinsey and company warned that 2 to 9% of high school students would drop out, and that U.S. students may lose up to a year's full-time earnings over their lifetime as a result of, I mean, that's a year out of their working life, out of the COVID-related learning losses in terms of earning potential. You know, I mean, that is a significant and jaw-dropping amount of loss, you know, for this period of time. It gives people a way to grasp it, you know.
Yes, I mean, economists can quantify this. If they can show that fewer students actually manage to acquire a credential from a college, a university, or a trade, that means that the cohort as a whole is not going to earn as much as it would have, because it didn't get the opportunity, the education opportunities that they are entitled and that the system promises to give them. And so the damage, so the system carries on, but the damage is the burden is paid, the cost is paid by the child who doesn't get the access to. Now, one of the numbers I collected from official government sources, about 8,000 low-income students did not apply to the grants to go to college that our state provides, because they did not feel confident enough to go to college. And you hear this story over and over again from parents. During COVID, I heard this over and over again from mothers and fathers upset about what was happening with the closed schools. They say, my child is losing hope and interest and dedication to the task of getting educated, because I see that the schools don't seem to be interested in keeping the schools open. So why should I study? You can see kids that are sort of on the border, who are not successful in school, who are always questioning their, their abilities, just losing interest and not trying any longer. And this is what I'm hearing. And this is what is bearing out in these numbers. Fewer people, fewer kids applying to college, fewer kids actually graduate. And then the concomitant, the effort to lower the quality of the standards so that the system can maintain its 80% graduation rates. That is also just dismaying, to see them reduce the high school graduation credits that are needed to graduate, to removing, the failing grades. They did that. They lowered the standards so the kids could get through, and that's just to make themselves look good. It doesn't certainly do anything for the children. So that we've just had this amazing, terrible experiment of what the system, how a public school monopoly reacts under an emergency like this. And what it does is, as I've cataloged in the study and elsewhere, it protects itself first. It makes sure its money continues. It makes sure that everyone gets paid, and then the children are thought about maybe not at all. So it's very discouraging, but we can learn from this if we talk about it and share and share this information, because this is going to continue. This is just a snapshot in time of studies that I collected. There have been more since I got this paper study. There was a study out of Harvard from Thomas Kane saying it's imperative that we fix this problem now. And I don't see any urgency amongst our education leaders in response to these studies. And I just hope that families are taking the steps they need to help their children catch up, because it's the family's responsibility, and it's clear that the system is not taking responsibility. So it's up to the family, and the resulting policy has to be give families more control over the dollars so that they can actually educate their children well.
Okay, here's a question from Loretta. She says, I've talked to teachers who say children know that the assessments at 3rd and 5th grade don't matter. Why not have a policy requiring 5th grade students to be at grade level before they can move on to middle school?
Yeah, you could have that policy. They do this in other smaller, they tried this in Florida. They tried a policy where 3rd graders that didn't read at a certain level were not allowed to progress. And this caused all kinds of other problems, because you end up having children who are very mature, they're still in 3rd grade, and you're essentially shaming them for the failure of the school to teach them. So the child ends up paying the price of broad policies like that. It's a much better policy to free up the capacity of the teacher to individualize the program for each child, like they do in charter schools and in private schools.
Next question is from Deborah. Early this year, Reichdahl, that's OSPI, Superintendent of Public Instruction, Reichdahl said he felt that academic testing should be discontinued. I don't know if that would occur through rulemaking or where that stands. The idea that testing will be modified or discontinued is alarming. She'd like comment on that.
Well, yes, of course. My whole study is based on testing the children before and after COVID. If we didn't have tests, we wouldn't know how big the damage has been as a result of closed schools. So if there were ever a testament for the necessity of testing, it's what's happened after COVID. So for the leader of the education system, the topmost education official in the state, to call for an end to testing, it just boggles the mind. I suppose he doesn't like testing because it makes him look bad.
Well, it's interesting to note the Superintendent of Public Instruction's office thought you were unfair with that. And we responded to that. We allowed people, we put up the entire presentation that Superintendent Reichdahl made to the State Board of Education. We put up the extended video clip so you could see the context in which he was speaking. We cited the email that his communication staff listed what they thought was the context that proved that that our commentary was misleading. And I am 100% certain that if you watch his presentation or read the transcript of it, and you see the context where he cites numerous tests that, I mean, these are tests going back, at least a decade and a half, maybe longer, of all the different statewide tests and talking about how worthless they were, and then going to this current one and then saying, I'm looking at ways to exit us from this. I'm just not sure if I have the authority or not. I think it's very clear what he was intending. And when he talks about, how he might, when he says what they might have to put in there instead, he cites what businesses want, is emotional development and a bunch of things that would be they're very subjective, not the kinds of things you measure in terms of concrete learning.
I just think that the focus is wrong here. It's not to please the superintendent of public instruction. The focus is to help the children learn what they need to know. And if the parents were in charge of a portion of the money the state provides is $18,000 per student now on average statewide. If parents had control over about 10,000 of those dollars, they would use those dollars and send them to a school that would actually succeed at teaching them how to read and do math. And then all this discussion about whether testing is fair or not, who cares? It would be in the hands and the responsibility of the parents. And if parents rely on tests, then let them rely on tests. If they don't rely on tests, fine. But all this controversy over testing misses the point. Is the state superintendent should be giving more options to families so they can get their kids educated. That is what he should be doing. And it's important that we are living in a very competitive world right now. And it's more competitive than ever. Our kids really need the skills that the schools promise to give them. And if they don't do that, then parents should get the money so they can find a school that accomplishes the task.
Next question. Most people don't really care about what is already done, but many parents and teachers are upset that kids are being moved forward regardless of their abilities. Less than 50% of kids were reading, writing, and doing math at grade level, even before COVID. So was there a major decline in state assessments between 2018 and 2021? Children in fifth grade are not being held back even if they cannot read at grade level. And now children who missed kindergarten and first grade completely are also being moved on. We need to look at those policies. And I think that's exactly the issue you brought up, Liv. But how about this question? Was there a decline in assessments between 2018 and 2021?
Yes. If you look at the study, I put a graph up showing how they dropped. I mean, they weren't great to begin with, but now they're much worse. So, it's a terrible thing because imagine the struggles of the child who is expected to do fourth grade work when they haven't gotten the basics from second grade, and then the slow erosion of their self-confidence over time. And this is, by the time they're in middle school, they start checking out, looking outside of school for entertainment. They're not thinking about getting an education and how important it is. It's very important to keep children motivated and happy and encouraged. And this is like the absolute worst thing to do if you're trying to keep your kids focused and encouraged on getting a good education.
Next question. What can citizens do to influence this area of policy or otherwise help?
Well, it seems to me that the best way to improve this is to talk about policies that fund the child, not the system. Start talking about the system versus the child, and how that concept, what can be done when you give the child a choice in his or her education, and what tremendous creativity and opportunity that opens up. Start talking about Montessori schools focused on arts and language, schools focused on biology, whatever. And the children are wonderful creatures. They are curious. They want to learn. They have boundless energy for improving themselves. And if you were to they've been forced into this narrow box of the public school one size fits all system. And if you would release them from that, you would have, we would see a flourishing and a growth that would just engage everyone in a positive way. And that's the vision forward. It is possible. I mean, yes, just this last month, the state of Arizona passed a school choice bill for every child in Arizona. Every family in Arizona who wants one can get they call it an empowerment savings account with $6,500 for that child to customize the education of the child. So if the child is and if the child is special needs, they will get additional funding according to the category of special needs that they have. And with that money, the parents can look around and find, or even start their own school and create a program that will best meet the needs of the child, or put their child in an existing private school. And with that, you would unleash the potential of the children and of the educators. I mean, this would be much better for teachers as well. They would not be forced into this, compliance model that we have today. So that's the vision going forward. And I think talking about that to everyone and everyone who has the power to make change in a policy, I think that's the way forward for the children in Washington State.
Next question. We've talked about how parents should have the power to help their children learn and choose which schools or resources they should receive. But what about parents who work or were essential workers? What if they don't have the time or mental capacity to look into these educational options?
Well, I think parents have endless capacity to meet the needs of their children. I mean, I know parents who work 2 or 3 jobs that would have the energy to find a better school for their child. So I just think, let's give them a chance. Let's give them an opportunity. There's always, I heard this fantastic presentation yesterday with Corey DeAngelis before the Heritage Foundation. And someone raised that question, the concern about, if we give parents control over the funding, will the schools that they go to get under the control of the state? And he says, that is a fear of a possibility in the future. He says there's always a trade-off with policies like this. But when you compare that to the existing known shortcomings of the existing system against the possible shortcomings of a different system, it's worth taking a chance on it and giving parents this control. I mean, in my experience, parents from all walks of life care very much about the education of their children, and they will find the best fit for their child if given the power to do so. So I am skeptical of that argument. I think parents have actually been conditioned to feel that they don't have any say. I mean, we allow parents to buy houses, and we allow parents to buy cars and go shopping and buy insurance and all that. Somehow they find time to do that. And when it comes to their children, I would think every parent has a lot of time and energy to make sure their child gets the best possible education. We should give them the chance.
I'll add, I know nothing about cell phones, and I just rely on the competition that creates a better and better cell phone.
There you are.
It takes me about 10 minutes when I want a new one. I go look at the comparisons, and somebody has printed out these nice little sheets that show what each can do. And then I make my decision from there.
Well, you're relying on the market, Dave.
That's right.
And I remember when I put my kids in school, I talked to all the parents about what school was good and what teacher was good. And it turned out that the reputation of the schools was very accurately encapsulated in the attitudes of parents. So you can rely on your friends, and they will tell you the truth about a school or a teacher. And that is word of mouth, very powerful and often very accurate. Of course, you have to check for yourself. You have to confirm and verify, but often you can rely on how other parents, think about the schools.
Is there any truth, this next question, is there any truth to some reports that Washington schools will be piloting or moving to a non-failable grading system where all students graduate regardless of studies?
Yes, I'm concerned about this. There's this, and I'm still researching it. I don't know the full ramifications of it all, but I'm seeing indications of moving away from the A, B, C, D, F basis for grading to a 1, 2, 3, 4 basis for grading, and which includes no failing. It's called mastery-based learning. And the idea is that the child masters the learning content standard and then moves on to the next one. And so far, the research does not bear out that this works. And I have heard lots of complaints against it because it undermines the, incentive that children have for not failing. All right. So, yes, this is in the works. It's possible that will happen.
Yeah, it's stunning to think of, and yet, as we talked about a little bit earlier, here we have, all the evidence in the world of major learning loss, and the big emphasis is on just pushing through rather than, addressing the idea that, hey, it might be that we need to keep more students in a single grade until they reach these milestones of learning. And because if you don't, you have lifelong consequences and employment consequences and other things that end up. But that's
and then part of the problem is this. It's interesting to watch the public charter schools, what they do with children that come to them 3 or 4 years behind in grade level learning. This is typical. The charter schools in our state, they have families coming that are their kids are way behind. And these charter schools do something very interesting. They focus on, they increase the amount of time spent on reading and math, the 2 essential skills that kids must learn, instead of minimizing the focus on reading and math by adding all these other subjects, which is what's happening in a lot of middle schools. Okay, so first get your basic skills down, and then you can go into the other subjects and be effective at learning those subjects. So that could be done. That could have been done in response to COVID, but you don't see that.
Next question from Cynthia. Does the superintendent of schools have a plan to accelerate learning in our schools across Washington state?
No, to accelerate learning?
Yeah.
No, I don't see any plan. He does pay lip service to making up COVID learning loss, but I don't see any real big push for that. I don't see a concerted effort, a central effort to increase, to identify, to measure where the kids are, what they lost during COVID, and bring them up to speed. I don't see anything like that.
Next question is from Laura. Is the private sector in Washington doing anything to help students? Achieve Pinal, it's a county in Arizona, is an organization seeking to help students recover learning loss. Businesses and nonprofits are collaborating to bring retirees together to tutor K-2 students specifically. Anything like that in Washington that you're aware of?
Yes, I have seen. I saw one district in Eastern Washington bringing in outside retirees to help kids in schools this summer. So there are individual districts that are recognizing the problem and doing what they can to help. And I have noticed that they're bringing in outside retirees to help. I think that's a great idea.
Next question is regarding the emergency powers. While Inslee has repeatedly revised the specifics of his multiple executive orders, the emergency declaration continues to be renewed by the legislature's 2 caucus chairs. Is there any hint whatsoever that the emergency itself shall be ended? On this score, it's the governor alone. Jason Mercier has written extensively about this, and you can read about it on the government reform tab at washingtonpolicy.org. There's also a video that explains the whole thing in about 2 minutes that you can see on our YouTube channel in the Animate This. It's a little animated video. The governor decides in Washington state when the emergency ends. That's unless the legislature gets in and changes the law. Until they do that, the governor gets to decide when the emergency ends, and he also decides when the emergency exists.
900 days. We're at 900 days and counting. And of course, the emergency powers, it was stunning to watch the state superintendent use his emergency powers to force districts to put masks on the kids. He threatened to withhold their funding if they didn't put masks on the kids way late into COVID, when families were fed up with it and everyone realized that masks weren't making a big difference at all in the spread of COVID. And so he threatened to withhold funding of school districts because the power, once they seize these emergency powers, they can withhold funding, they can control everyone. And
yeah, if you go to WashingtonPolicy.org and if you scroll down the main page, we have a ticking clock of the state of emergency order of 898 days, 22 hours, and 59 minutes right now. And we've got the seconds too. Right below that is the need for emergency powers reform, why we need that reform. And that would answer your questions really well.
That's right. 898, not 900, 898 days.
We're getting there. We're getting there. So tomorrow we will be at 900 days because this 898 is going to turn to 899 here in a couple of hours, and then we'll reach 900 tomorrow. And you know, this isn't the official clock. This is our clock. Based on the first media report of the emergency hour from King 5. So yeah, it's a challenging issue.
Well, this is why it's so important to quantify, to write down the orders that were passed that pertain to education, which I have done in this study. So now anyone can find what was done, and people will not forget, let's hope. And that we continue to collect the evidence of the damage and make the case for giving parents more control over the funding. So that the state cannot close down every, you know, the schools of 90% of the students in Washington State again. I mean,
yeah. It's I'm putting the link to the study in the chat for everybody. If you want to go directly to the study, it's really easy to find though at WashingtonPolicy.org. You know, in fact, it'll be highlighted on the homepage here shortly. But you know, you can see the key findings or key takeaways that we've presented there, so you can share those with friends and others. Real quick question from Tanya. School choice in schooling, choice in schooling is very important. Arizona's on track, the right track, with 500 plus charter schools. And now, she says, I believe they've secured educational funding that will follow students and not the system. Is it just the power of Washington's teachers union that's fighting this, or is the legislature in Olympia just as complicit?
I'd say it's the most powerful special interest in public education is the teachers union. It's also, I think, the most powerful special interest in Washington State, the WEA teachers union. And they have a veto power over proposals to give parents school choice in the state legislature.
Yeah, they're a very, very powerful entity, and you know, there's a lot of money involved there, you know, and so what we've, you know, there's a lot of the last WPC poll on school choice showed, what was it, Liv? 72% support for school choice. I mean, it's overwhelming support for parents who want to be able to send their child to the school of their choice.
So that was another side effect of the COVID school shutdowns, is that the support for school choice went from 62% to 72%, and it is strong amongst all demographic groups and political parties. Democrats support school choice now, as do Republicans, as do independents. So it's just the legislature is behind, but public opinion is in strong support of helping families educate their children, because it's through a school choice program, because it serves the public interest, of course. Whether it's, you know, the public interest is having an educated populace. And now, when the government closes the schools for nearly 2 years, you're not going to have an educated populace. And so giving families options so that they can educate their children meets the need of the society to have educated children. So it's in the public interest to give families this option. And it's not, you know, this is not controversial idea. Maybe it is amongst union defenders in Washington State, but across the nation, 32 states and the District of Columbia have these school choice options, and they're wildly popular with low-income families who need them the most. So this is just a lagging, you know, to Tanya. This will happen eventually as the legislature catches up with the will of the people.
There's a quick question. What was the poll referenced about school choice? That was a poll that Washington Policy Center commissioned. I want to say it was the end of 2021. and it's still available on the website there. I can't grab the link right now, but right. If you scroll through on the education page on the tab, go to the education page and scroll down, there was a specific write-up regarding the education results, and you'll be able to find it there.
In this state, absolutely, and nationwide.
That's right. For our poll, though, I think it was a poll of, I want to say 500 Washington read. The details are up there, but it was a legit poll. We tried to balance it out with the appropriate balance of Democrats, Republicans, and independents. We wanted an honest assessment of where Washington State residents stood on the issue, and it was a surprising and an encouraging result. From Greg, Liv, you're doing God's work here. Do you have data? Do you have data on health, specifically mortality rates, on states that closed schools versus those that did not? Because that was the big rationale for closing schools.
I don't have that. I don't have that, but I think we would have seen that by now, in the media. That's a great question, and I'll look for it. I'll see. I did see some information that that Dave sent me from Sweden, where the students there had no pandemic learning loss because they kept their schools open. Now, I know that initially Sweden had bad numbers, COVID numbers compared to the shutdown in Norway, but over time, I don't know if that's evened out or not, what the end result of that was.
Yeah, I think Todd Myers also did some work on mortality rates in places, with severe restrictions versus less restrictions. So I'll take a look for that, and if I find it, I'll link up to that. I'll make it a related link on the highlight of the study later on today, after this broadcast.
Well, it's so interesting to see how compare the public school system with the private schools. They figured out ways to reopen and get desks far apart and have various measures so they could open to in-person instruction. But the public school system is so massive and so centralized. And I remember thinking, why can't the teachers just meet with 10 or 15 students that they, for the period of time of worry about the COVID spreading, right? And just decentralize, make all the units that are getting together much smaller so that you're not exposing teachers or children to many, many people in the schools. That would have been something we could have done, but the public schools didn't even try.
All right, Liv,
it's impossible.
We have 3 minutes left, and that means we have less than 3 minutes to answer the next three questions. So just a rapid fire, short answers for the next three. Have you seen any studies that indicate the presence of charter schools or private schools have lowered the class sizes of surrounding public schools?
That public charter schools lower the class sizes?
Yeah, the question is, with the additional school choice offered by charter schools, does it lower the class sizes in public schools?
Well, it should, but I haven't seen any studies showing that, but obviously it should, because it would take children from the public school system. But you know how the public school system adjusts and puts two classes together when they should be, into one when they should be two. So that's going to be a hard thing to study.
Also, I would point out charter schools often serve kids that might have dropped out otherwise. Kids, anecdotally, I've heard from kids who said, they were on a path that was not leading to staying in school until they found a school that better fit their needs. So hard to measure. Next question, public schools appear to have drifted beyond education, and they have increasing encroachment into social constructs, healthcare, food, counseling. It seemed to be the state's beachfront to state dependency on all these various fronts. How do we wake parents up to this well-organized intrusion? So much of this comes down to parents, but parents are not showing their strength, and teachers are cowed by unions. What do you see that can be done to wake people up?
So I would be pointing out to parents that it's their responsibility to educate their children, and that keeping focused on the central mission of education is imperative, because there's so much for the kids to learn. So to distract them with all this social and emotional stuff that's coming, this is all critical race theory indoctrination. I would just get up to speed on what's happening in the schools it's an easy matter to raise alarms right now in the minds of young parents, unfortunately.
Yeah, if the school shutdown of 2 years woke a lot of parents up in Washington State, and I think it showed people, that to looking out for their child is their job. That's who's really looking out for.
Right.
The best guardians of the child are their parents, and
right.
That's how it works.
And take control, and it's super rewarding. Much better than just feeling like a passive victim of what's going on with your child.
All right, just 10 seconds for this final question. How have the parochial schools results compared to public schools through the emergency?
Well, they stayed open. I mean, they opened up in the fall of 2020 when the public schools were closed, and their numbers show growth. They show what was the number now? I saw a 50% increase in homeschooling, because remember 41,000 families pulled their kids out of public schools, 54% increase in homeschooling, and I think it was between 10 and 20% increase in private school enrollment. So that tells you everything you need to know. Families are, if they have the resources, they're putting the kids in private schools now.
We have some new videos coming out illustrating specific points about this study. You'll see those come out, both one came out yesterday, one or two will come out today, and then throughout the week. We'll have some additional images, plus, of course, the text of the study itself. So there's a lot of things to see and share and enjoy at washingtonpolicy.org and on our social media pages on Facebook, on Instagram, on TikTok and YouTube. So we hope that you'll join us there and share the information that most inspires you. Liv Finne, thanks so much for your work and the new study. And we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Thanks, Liv. Thank you all.
Thank you.